Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, Director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentations by the Levin Center's two 2024-2025 Oversight Fellows. Earlier this year, we renamed this program the Elise J. Bean Oversight Fellowship to honor the life and work of our beloved late colleague, Elise Bean. As she was with so much else here at the Levin Center, Elise was pivotal to the development of the fellowship, and she would be so proud of the work it has inspired. The goal of the Bean Oversight Fellowship, which was first launched in 2021, is to encourage scholarly research on how legislatures at both the state and federal levels fulfill their duty to conduct oversight, or as the Supreme Court stated over 70 years ago, to serve as the eyes and voice of the people. We seek to encourage scholars, especially those earlier in their careers, to conduct research and produce papers on how legislators hold the executive branch accountable and assess and hopefully improve government performance. This non-resident fellowship includes a stipend and funds to defray research costs and does not have a teaching requirement. We do, however, ask our fellows to present the results of their research, and that is why we're here today. We will hear presentations from both of our 2024-2025 Bean Oversight Fellows. After each presentation, we will have a discussant review the paper and ask questions. Members of the audience are also encouraged to submit questions using the webinar's question tab at the bottom of the screen. Now, in a moment, I will introduce our first Oversight Fellow and discussant, but before I do so, let me just say that applications for the 2026-27 Bean Oversight Fellowship will open on December 1st, 2025, and close on January 31st of 2026. Information about the fellowship can be found on our website, levin-center.org. And with that, let me introduce our first Elise J. Bean Oversight Fellow. Connor Dye is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where his research focuses on congressional oversight, bureaucratic politics, and regulatory policy. Connor earned his PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin in 2024. Connor's work explores the proactive use of oversight by legislative committees to shape how agencies respond to emerging and complex problems. His research examines the motivations behind proactive oversight, how legislative and bureaucratic actors interact during the process, and how these dynamics influence public policy outcomes. Connor's paper will be discussed by Professor Charles Shippen. Chuck is the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Professor of Social Science at the University of Michigan. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science and a professor by courtesy at the Ford School of Public Policy. During his distinguished career, Professor Shippen has also held positions at the University of Iowa, the University of Sydney, the London School of Economics, and the Brookings Institution, among others. He is also the author of several books, including Why Policies Spread and Good Ones Don't, and numerous articles. And Chuck has received many awards for his research and writing, more than I can even list here today. And we're very pleased to have him serve as discussant. And with that, Connor, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jim. Let me get to my presentation. Okay, someone let me know if you can't see this, but as far as I can know, it's good. So during my fellowship, I developed this concept of proactive, policy-oriented oversight that I am really excited to share with you today. But before I begin, I just wanted to demonstrate what I am talking about through an example. So many of you are probably familiar with PFAs. They are these harmful chemicals that are in essentially all of the everyday products that we use, unfortunately. and they have this very harmful effect on various health outcomes. Well, back in 2018, we still did not have regulations that controlled the amounts of these PFAs that were permitted in drinking water. And so in 2018, the Senate subcommittee on emergency management held a hearing where they brought the EPA in and they asked the EPA to issue regulations or issue standards to regulate the amount of PFAs in drinking water. And within 5 months of this hearing, all of a sudden, the EPA issued a notice for public comments regulating the level of PFAs in drinking water. And now today, we do have standards for the amount of these chemicals that can be in our drinking water. And the reason that this case is so interesting to me in the context of oversight is because this is exactly the opposite of how we would expect oversight to work. Right now, oversight is primarily defined as reviewing past decisions made by federal agencies. And so in this model, we essentially have an agency making a decision, and then committees performing oversight either as a result of fire alarms or throughout their own prerogative through police patrols. And then they perform oversight and the agency adjusts its output. But there are several problems with this reactive model. The first, of course, is that it does not actually account for the example I just provided, right? That oversight preceded the agency decision in this context. And then there's this broader problem that this model of oversight has been dealing with for the last 30 years, trying to address this question of why we see so much police patrol oversight. The logic within this model would suggest that that committees should be primarily relying on so-called fire alarms, which are essentially interest groups and constituents telling committees when an agency has violated some legislative provision. But in reality, what we found is that committees are regularly perform oversight on their own prerogative. And we've been really unable to explain why we see so much of this police patrol oversight. And my argument is that what we are seeing as police patrol oversight is primarily proactive, policy-oriented oversight. And this is based on a different set of factors or a different set of drivers than traditional oversight. Rather than reacting to agency decisions, policy-oriented oversight reacts to public opinion. And so this is the idea that issues will emerge on the public agenda, and committees want to be able to address issues that are important to the public. However, the legislative process is not available to all committees, right? It can either be because of gridlock, or it could be because a committee's jurisdiction does not align with the problem that's currently salient at that given point in time, right? For instance, the Committee on Agriculture is not able to effectively legislate on issues related to defense policy because their legislative jurisdiction does not expand to that area. And so committees will use proactive oversight as this alternative venue of policy development where they can indirectly influence the direction of public policy. And again, this is not as direct of a mechanism of policymaking as we would expect from the legislative process, but there are still ways that committees can influence the downstream policy consequences through this informal venue. And they can either position agencies for legislative incorporation, where they will bring an agency in, highlight how the agency's programs could be used to address a salient problem, and that will affect whether or not that agency gets incorporated into future legislation addressing that problem. And then it could also influence policy from below, essentially altering the agency priorities. The federal bureaucracy has a lot of leeway in the issues that they address, and so committees can try to steer the direction in which federal agencies are addressing problems through proactive oversight. Now, this very simple model of policy-oriented oversight generates several predictions about when we should expect committees to perform oversight, as well as who is the subject of proactive oversight. So the first concerns the timing of proactive oversight. And from this basis, we should expect for committees to conduct more proactive policy-oriented oversight hearings on salient issues, right? So if it's all driven by public opinion, we should be expecting that when an issue breaks out onto the public agenda, all of the committees are going to want to address those problems, and they're going to use proactive oversight as this means to an attempt to address those issues. However, the committees that rely on proactive oversight should be those that are less effective in the legislative process, right? Proactive oversight is this substitution venue for the legislative process. If a committee could address these salient problems through laws, they would prefer to do that because that gives them more direct control over policy outcomes. And so what we should expect is that the committees that are less effective at getting legislation through the legislative process will be those same committees that are investing in proactive oversights on these salient issues. So when an issue breaks out into the public agenda, it should be the less effective committees that are actually performing more proactive oversight. My perspective of policy-oriented oversight also generates predictions about who should be selected for which agencies should be the subject of proactive oversight. And we'd expect that if proactive oversight is being used as this venue of policy development, committees should be engaging more with their ideologically proximate agencies, their friends, during these proactive oversight hearings as opposed to their enemies. And this is because if you want to influence policy indirectly, committees are going to want to incorporate those agencies that share their worldview. And I want to point out that this is in direct contrast to what the audit-based model of oversight would predict, right? If a committee is just auditing federal agencies, they're going to be prioritizing the ideologically distant agencies because those are the agencies that are most likely to enact policy in a manner that the committees would not support. Okay, so to test both of these expectations, what I spent a lot of my fellowship doing was collecting various data sets. But one of the data sets that I spent a long time trying to create was this data set of proactive oversight hearings. And I have provided a lot of details in the report about how I actually code proactive oversight hearings. But for now, you can think of proactive oversight hearings as non-legislative hearings that concern a broader problem. And the way I created this data set was through first developing a training data set that consists of, I think, about 5,000 hearings using undergraduate research assistants. And then using this training data set, I trained a model to automatically classify the remaining 50,000 non-legislative hearings that have been held over the last 70 years. And I use a transformer-based approach to categorize hearings as proactive because I wanted to be careful not to include oversight hearings that were reviewing agency decisions as proactive oversight. And so through using a transformer-based approach, I can actually differentiate between hearings that were concerning broader problems and hearings that were concerning specific agency programs, even if there were similar words being used across the hearings, such as the word examine. And then once I created this data set of proactive oversight hearings, I then removed all hearings that did not include the testimony from at least one agency because at its core, oversight is an interaction between, or at least congressional oversight in the way I'm defining it is an interaction between Congress and the bureaucracy. Okay, so using this data set, I was able to generate or create a novel data set of all the proactive oversight hearings that Congress has held over time. And this is the line in gray. And as you can see, proactive oversight is prevalent in Congress. And this reactive line that I'm showing is a data set that was developed by other scholars. But the whole point of this is that proactive oversight is this prevalent feature. And I'm going to use this data set to be able to test the hypotheses that I outlined above. So the first concern is, when do committees perform proactive oversight? To test this, I took all of the proactive oversight hearings and then I grouped them based on the committees that held the hearings and the topics that the hearings were about. So for instance, for the Committee on Agriculture, I counted the number of proactive oversight hearings held by that committee on agricultural issues, defense issues, energy issues, 20 different issues. And I did this for every committee in every year. And this first result of looking at salience is looking at when more of the public says that there's a particular issue is the most important problem facing the country, how does that affect proactive oversight? And the finding here indicates that when an issue becomes more salient, committees are performing more proactive oversight on that very issue. Okay, so this directly aligns with what we'd expect, right? When an issue becomes salient, committees are going to be jumping in and performing proactive oversight. The second variable is committee effectiveness, and this is a variable that is measuring how effective each committee was at producing legislation on each topic. And I adopt this measure from the popular legislative effectiveness scores that were produced by Volden and Wiseman. I used a very similar approach to generate these scores, and I generated across both committee and issue area. And the scores would look like how you'd largely imagine them to look, right? The Committee on Agriculture is really effective at producing legislation on agriculture-related issues, not so effective at producing legislation on defense-related issues. And so using this measure, I'm able to gauge how effective each committee was in the legislative process in each year. And the findings here also conform with our expectations, right? If a committee holding salience constant, so even with issues are not salient, more effective committees are going to be the ones that are performing proactive oversight over those issues, right? If you think back to the agricultural example I've been using, even if agriculture isn't popular in the public, the Committee on Agriculture will still be trying to influence policy in that domain. But the truly interesting finding, though, is when you look at how the interaction effect between salience and committee effectiveness. Once an issue rises on the agenda, the less effective committees are the ones that are more likely to be performing oversight. And this is because the more effective committees, like the Committee on Agriculture, if agriculture rises on the public agenda, they're going to be trying to rely on the legislative process in order to enact policy change, while the less effective committees are going to be investing in proactive oversight because they can't really get anything through the legislative process. And so this is supporting this idea of proactive oversight being used as an alternative venue for policy development. Okay, to get at the second question, who do committees prioritize in proactive oversight? I took all the proactive oversight hearings that I coded, and then I gathered all of the agencies that testified at each of these hearings over the 50-year period. After collecting the agencies, I used a very popular data set of these Chen and Johnson ideology scores to identify the ideology of each agency. And then I calculated the distance of that agency's ideology to the committee median to get this idea of, are committees prioritizing their agencies that they're aligned with or less aligned with, friends versus enemies. And what the results show is that committees are prioritizing the agencies that they are ideologically closer to. All right. And so when a committee is performing proactive oversight, they're bringing in agencies that share their ideological worldview as opposed to those that do not. And again, this is directly contradictory to what we'd expect from the audit-based model. So what both of these results provide the evidence for is that committees are using proactive oversight as this alternative venue to develop policy. And they're doing so by bringing in their agencies that that they are aligned with, ideologically speaking, to try to influence the downstream development of policy. Now, what I focused on today is just really the first half of my report. The second half of the report was looking at the policy consequences, right? So committees are attempting to use proactive oversight as this venue of policy development. And in the second half of the report, I wanted to look at, does this actually have an effect? And I've specifically focused on how proactive oversight influences agency priorities. I don't have enough time to, of course, go through that entire second half of the report, but I just wanted to point out, to try to get at this question, I developed a novel data set that accounts for the novelty of issues that agencies are addressing in each year. And so I built this data set from the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the codification of all regulations that are produced across all agencies in each year. And I essentially tracked the new words that each agency would use in the year that have never been used before in the past, to try to get this idea of when are agencies addressing more novel problems. So for instance, in this graph, for the EPA in the year 2000, right, I'd be looking at how many words were incorporated into the regulatory text produced by the EPA that were never used in any of the previous regulations from 1970 all the way up to 2000. And so through this, I'm attempting to gauge how novel, or the extent that agencies are addressing novel problems. And I am looking at whether or not proactive oversight preceded these expansions of regulatory authority by each agency. But to to get a full picture of what I'm doing here, you'd have to read the second half of the report, which I encourage you to do, of course. So the big takeaways here are that proactive oversight is an alternative venue of policy development. When committees are unable to enact policy through the legislative process, they're likely to find alternative venues to try to influence the downstream development of policy. This can be good or bad depending on how you look at it, right? On the one hand, in the face of gridlock, Congress may still retain control over how the bureaucracy is addressing new problems. At the same time, though, this type of control exercised during proactive oversight is may not reach our majoritarian ideals because instead of having all committees come together and agree on these set of issues the bureaucracy should be addressing, it's a single committee telling an agency what to do. The other big takeaway here is that what scholars have previously characterized as police patrol oversight consists primarily of proactively developing policy as opposed to auditing the federal bureaucracy. And this could resolve a discrepancy between what the fire alarm police patrol model of oversight would predict and some of the empirical findings. Because rather than committees using police patrol oversight as a means to audit the federal bureaucracy, they were using this as as an alternative venue to attempt to influence policy. So with that being said, I wanted to say, again, thank you to the Levin Center. I don't know if y'all kept track, but there were 4 original data sets that I had used in this throughout this presentation, and it would have been impossible to get this done without their help and supports. And so with that being said, I think it's time to turn it over to Chuck.
Great. Connor, can you close the screen?
Yeah.
Great. Well, first, I would like to thank the Levin Center for inviting me to take part in this event and actually for all of the great work they do in this area. It's wonderful. I'd also like to thank Connor, who has written a terrific paper about this surprisingly overlooked aspect of oversight. It's actually 2 papers. I'll get to that in a minute. There's no need for me to repeat all of the things that he just was telling you about. He did a great job, I think, of explaining that. But I do want to quickly highlight what I think a few of the really positive aspects are here. First of all, conceptually, this idea to look at oversight as being proactive rather than reactive, where the goal is now to generate or stimulate new policy. I think that's a really important insight. And as Connor was just mentioning, it helps us make sense of some existing findings, like the prevalence of police patrol oversight. I think it's smart that he looks at it in multiple ways. In the first part of the paper, he focuses on the actions of committees and makes the argument that proactive oversight hearings are a function of issue salience, the effectiveness of committees, and ideological alignment. And then in the second part, he focuses on the actions of agencies. So here it's about explaining regulatory expansion, which is, as I'll mention later, a really good new idea, and that this expansion is a function then of proactive oversight. Couple more things, the data, wow. A lot of really great information about hearings and agency actions here. It's smart and creative collection of data. And then the analysis that follows is also careful and clever and thoughtful. So really well done. Also, I want to highlight something, which is that isn't always the case, but this paper is an absolute pleasure to read. It is so well written and engaging. So in general, excellent work. I'm going to raise a number of issues to think about, but these all fall into the category of clarifications or improvement, not fundamental errors that need to be fixed. And as I mentioned, this is really 2 separate papers, one on committee proactive oversight hearings as an effect, the other on these hearings as a cause. Obviously, they're related, but they're just kind of mushed together. So I'm going to talk about both of them, but following Connor's lead, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the first of these. Okay, so the first part is about these committee proactive hearings. And the goal here is to explain them. And as I mentioned, he looks at the salience of the issues, the institutional capacity, ideology. And basically what he says here is that we know that proactive oversight exists, but we don't know a lot else about it. In particular, we don't know when it happens or how often it happens. And so he examines this and then finds evidence for the theoretical ideas he put forward. Okay, so what are some of the issues? And in part, this sort of made me think of a bunch of different things. So this is where this is going to head now. First, the paper characterizes proactive oversight as a substitute for lawmaking. It's an interesting idea and it's plausible, but I'm not entirely sure about it. For one thing, it's not clear that legislators would get nearly as much credit from constituents for doing this sort of activity as for passing a law. So if it is a substitute, it's a substitute that comes with some considerable costs, unless you're assuming that legislators are driven exclusively by the policies they're going to get. But to the extent that they're thinking about electoral credit, credit claiming, and things like that, there are some downsides to doing this. It also seems that one could make a case that these are actually complements. If you're good at one of these things, you're going to be good at both of those. And in the paper, Connor does touch on this briefly, but I would argue that a lot of the skills that a committee would have would be transferable across hearings versus legislation. Okay, so moving forward from this, but in a similar area, I wanted to talk about the committees themselves and the committee effectiveness scores. The theory doesn't make any predictions for the effect of committee effectiveness. It makes predictions for issue salience, and it makes predictions for how the effectiveness of committees might interact with that, but nothing specifically for committee effectiveness. But then the results show this very strong and precisely estimated effect that increases in committees' effectiveness is associated with more proactive oversight hearings, at least for lower salience issues. But that got me thinking about why. The CES scores, these committee effectiveness scores, are about measuring when a committee is good at lawmaking. So if lawmaking and proactive oversight hearings are substitutes, then why would we see that committees that are better at passing laws then end up doing more oversight? Why wouldn't they just pass more laws? But maybe it's that they do more of both of these things. And this gets to the complement as opposed to substitute aspect. And so I think that's something worth at least considering. Now, figure 4, which is one that Connor showed, it was the one with all of the lines that intersect. It shows that highly effective committees hold more hearings for all but the very most important problems. So what we're really seeing then is for many of these committees, what they're doing is they are passing laws and holding proactive hearings, right? Because the reason they have high scores on this committee effectiveness scale is because they've been able to push their bills through the process and often into law. So, also related to this, Connor showed a chart looking at the prevalence of proactive versus reactive hearings. Maybe increases in committee effectiveness scores are associated with more hearings of all kinds. So that is something that I would definitely encourage him to check out. That chart also, didn't think of it until I saw it on the screen just now. You might consider making your dependent variable the percentage of hearings that are proactive as opposed to reactive. Okay, still in the first part of this paper where we're looking at the explaining the use of these oversight hearings. The paper then examines the counts of testimony among each committee agency dyad. So each committee with each agency checks all of those. And this shows nicely, I think, the importance of ideological divergence. Then the issue is, though, if this matters, why isn't it incorporated somehow into the initial tests of Table 1? So if we're saying that committees are more likely to do this if they're dealing with agencies that they share similarities with, then it seems like that's something that would affect the regression in the first table. I know you can't just do that easily because the second analysis is about dyads, about these committee agency pairs, whereas the first one is not. But without having anything in there about ideology, it makes me worry a little bit that the model is underspecified. So at a minimum, I would suggest looking at things like more extreme committees versus more moderate committees, or committees that deal with more extreme agencies versus more moderate agencies. I'm not exactly sure how to do that. And that's like the worst kind of discuss and comment. It's like, here's an idea. I couldn't figure out how to do it, but you should do it. But that's kind of the point I'm making here. Okay, moving on to the second part, and what will I think eventually be a second paper. This is about the policy consequences of proactive hearings. And the dependent variable here, as Connor was mentioning, is this idea of regulatory expansion. This is a great idea. And I really like the way it's operationalized, meaning I like the way it's measured and the way he looks at the data. The idea, he writes, is that bureaucracies don't make decisions about regulatory expansion in isolation. And so he wants to look at why they're doing this. Now, much political science oversight, I'm sorry, much political science literature does treat oversight as a constraint. And here he's saying, it can also be a driver. And so he's examining that aspect of it. Okay, couple issues on this part of the paper. A big point that you make is that this is about committees sending signals to agencies. So the signal is that they're holding hearings and they're telling agencies what sorts of policies they're interested in. You make the point that the signals have to be credible and informative. And I think those are absolutely right. But I think if I'm an agency, the third thing I need those signals to be is clear. And often I think they are because of the way hearings work. But then those signals become a little bit more muddied if, for example, there are other committees that are involved in this policy area, or if bills are referred to multiple committees. So there's a chance that the agency is getting cross signals from different places. An even greater issue might arise if the House and Senate are not on the same page. So if the House is sending signals that we want you to do these sorts of policies, but meanwhile the Senate is holding hearings that's saying, hold on, not so fast, then that again makes the signal less clear. Now, in some ways, you could argue that even with this muddiness that's possible, you're finding strong effects. But I would still, if I were doing this, I would want to find some ways to just check analytically some of these other possibilities. The second point is one that Connor addressed a little bit in his talk today and talks about a little bit in the paper, which is, what if the agency has already started acting in this area? Okay, we know that rules often take months or years to get created. And so there's a possibility that by the point at which the committee is holding these proactive hearings, the agency's been thinking about this for a while and conducting studies on it and forming some basic ideas. Now, there are some what are called placebo tests in this paper, which is what Connor's testing mainly is if his theory is true, we should see these effects. But then he says we should also not see these other sorts of effects. And that part of the paper is great. But it doesn't quite get at what I'm talking about here. You're kind of implying this causality where the committee hearings will now cause agencies to expand their regulatory actions. But my point is more about, it might be just that there's this rising tide and that Congress is going along with that. And some of that rising tide might have been created initially by the agency. Last point, the president. As we're seeing daily, hourly, by the minute, agencies exist within the sphere of the presidency. And yet the president is pretty absent here. The one way in which the president comes in is there's a control for whether control of government is divided. And that's a really good place to start. But it's not just that divided government could have this independent effect. It's that the effect of testimony, so the congressional hearings, could vary depending on whether or not Congress and the president are on the same page. So imagine, for example, that you've got a committee that's sending these signals to a committee and the president and Congress are on the same page. If that's the case, you would expect the agency to be very responsive to this. If, on the other hand, the agency is part of an administration that views things very differently, then we would expect these initial testimonies and these hearings overall not to have the same sort of effect. Anyway, there are a lot of other little things I could say, but I want to return to the main point, which is this is terrific stuff. This is some of the more interesting work that I've read on oversight and hearings in particular in quite a while. And I appreciated a chance to be able to read the paper. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I guess, yeah, back to me. So yeah, thank you so much for the comments. And it makes me really happy to hear that you thought it was interesting, because that's usually the goal of most of the research. I guess just to address some of the points you raised, all great points. Again, thank you. This is going to help a lot as I continue to develop both of these projects as separate papers. You were correct in identifying that they were meant to be two separate papers. The thing about the substitution versus complementing lawmaking, I completely understand where that's coming from, and I think there is something to that. To be quite frank, the committee legislative effectiveness scores were like a last minute thing that I figured out how to do and how to finally incorporate operationalize this concept. So as I worked through that, although I just saw that I have 3 minutes left, and as much as I'd like to keep responding to your comments, I'd also like to answer the few Q&A sessions. So apology if I might cut that off, but I guess I just went a little long during the presentation. Is the report available online? I'd love to read it. It will be. It will be available on my website, and I think Levin Center might also, or if Levin Center makes it available, that's great as well. But I will make it available on my websites. And then the second one, the findings seem very consistent with back-channel policymaking when legislators contact directly about policy issues. Look for alternative pathways. Legislative alternatives. Community and back-channel policymaking by or individual legislators. Okay, yeah, so Belinda Rushy, yeah, I can see what, so this is something that has guided a lot of my thinking about this, and the way that back-channel policymaking works, one of the incentives behind it is that it is outside of the public view. And so when you think about back-channel policymaking, it is them trying to get around their constituents in some ways, and the fact that it is private is what's driving a lot of this oversight activity. And so the way that I see this as almost a compliment is that this is a public venue where they are actually trying to make the point, look, we are trying to address these problems in various ways. And so there would be strategic differences in this, because it would be legislators clustering around the more salient topics that the public cares about, instead of them trying to go and address things behind or address problems behind closed doors. So yeah, this is one of the more formative pieces to how I've been thinking about this, and I'd love to answer any other questions that you have following this. But I can tell that my time is up, so I will, I guess, now turn it back over to Jim.
Oh, Connor, Connor and Chuck, thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. Connor, loved the paper, loved the analysis. I think all of us who read it learned a great deal from it. And Chuck, your comments were spot on. We at the Levin Center, a lot of this resonated with our experience in the practice of oversight and in the work that we do both with Congress and with state legislatures, in terms of what we're learning from them about how they view oversight, how they view it as more of, well, we'd like to say this, that oversight is never over when it's done well, when it's practiced in the way that we encourage the practice of it. And I think that's kind of borne out by these interactions that the paper identifies. I wish we had more time, but we've got to move on to our second paper and discussion. So I'd like to now shift to that and introduce the author of the second Bean Oversight Fellowship paper, and that is Jason Juffras. Jason received his PhD in public policy and administration from George Washington and has spent over 2 decades working as a budget director, program evaluator, and legislative analyst. He presently serves as a senior analyst in the Office of the District of Columbia Auditor, the audit and evaluation arm of the DC Council. While working there, Jason has designed and led evaluations of education, human services, and public safety programs Jason is recognized in his field in program evaluation. He was elected in 2021 to the Executive Committee of the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society, NLPES, and he has had a long-term interest in legislative oversight professionally, and some years ago really led the effort at the DC Council to conduct annual performance hearings to help the council do oversight during the budget process. He has also worked in the state of North Carolina and has served as an adjunct professor at George Washington University and at Virginia Tech. Discussing Jason's paper will be Jesse Crossan, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Purdue University and a fellow at the Center for Effective Lawmaking, which we were just discussing. Jesse is also co-director of the Program on American Institutional Renewal at Purdue, where he examines the transformation of American politics by partisan competition for control of institutions. And he studies the response to challenges that hyperpartisanship has introduced in our system. And I would be remiss if I did not note that Jesse, well, in addition to noting he received his PhD from the University of Michigan, I want to note that he serves as a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Levin Center's State Oversight Academy. So with no more ado, I want to turn things over to Jason. Please take it away.
Okay, it helps to start by unmuting yourself, but I'm going to share my screen. And so, okay, I hope everybody can see these slides. And so I'm Jason Juffras. The title of my presentation is Embedding Oversight in State Legislative Operations. And I want to say at the outset that I'm very grateful to the Levin Center for giving me the opportunity to conduct this research. And I also want to mention that I do work in the field of legislative audit and work for the Office of the District of Columbia Auditor, but the views that I'm expressing today are mine only. So in this presentation, I'm going to just go over my topic, objectives and methods. I'm going to talk about the role of different legislative units in the oversight system. I'm going to discuss some findings and recommendations, and then I'm going to offer some concluding observations. So I thought I should start just with the definition of legislative oversight that I'm using. I adopted a definition from the Congressional Research Service that considers legislative oversight to be the review, monitoring, and supervision of the executive branch and its implementation of public policy. Now, that is a broad definition, but it reflects the nature of oversight, which takes place in formal and informal settings, from committee hearings to perhaps a meeting between a legislator and senior agency officials in the legislator's office. Oversight varies in its scope and intensity. It uses many tools and techniques, from audits and investigations to performance reports to confirmation hearings to administrative rule review. I've excluded from my definition constituent service simply because it's a very atomized process, but I do acknowledge that when there are patterns of complaints that come in from constituents, that does create an important basis for legislative oversight. And finally, I also looked at oversight through a lens noted by the Levin Center, which has defined high-quality oversight as evidence-based and solutions-driven. It's also often bipartisan, but does not have to be. But that bipartisan approach gives also greater credibility and probably greater scope, and also sort of brings the legislature together as one powerful force. So the main objective of this project was to build on and extend previous work done by the Levin Center, in which the center examined oversight institutions and practices in 50 states in great detail. And the report I'm referring to is the 2019 report, Checks and Balances in Action. So my aim was to was to continue that work by conducting case studies of a small number of states to look at oversight as a system, sort of essentially a system of co-production, and to look at it as a collective output of the legislation in which there are many different parts that are contributing. So my 3 research questions were, number 1, what are the distinctive roles of the legislative oversight units in each state and how are they related? Number 2, to what extent are state legislative oversight units reinforcing and amplifying one another's oversight findings and recommendations? In other words, what are the links and connections that sense the concept of co-production that I referred to? And 3, what factors are associated with coordinated and sustained oversight by state legislative units? So my methods involved case studies in 6 states, and you can see their state seals on this slide: California, Connecticut, Montana, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. I conducted 40 interviews total with key officials and stakeholders who were generally current legislators, former legislators, senior legislative staff, and external stakeholders such as representatives from state-level think tanks or advocacy groups. Did extensive document review, which involved looking at committee agendas and minutes, at audit reports, budget reports, issue briefs, almost anything I could get my hands on. And also I observed committee and study group meetings, mostly virtually, but some also in person. Because you can see this is a huge scope right there, I focused on events taking place in calendar year 2023 and chose 3 policy areas: K through 12 education, Medicaid, and transportation as also a focus of my study. However, when people brought to my attention, largely through interviews, important cases or insights that were outside of that year or those policy fields, I also included them as well. So let's get, I just wanted to give a little background about those 6 states that I chose. I chose them purposefully. And I think there's no such thing as a representative sample of our 50 states. But you can see that I incorporated a lot of geographic diversity, population diversity, and political diversity, which is covered in the 2 columns on the right. So you'll notice that there are 2 states, California and Connecticut, that are solid blue states controlled by Democrats, 2 states, Montana and Texas, solid red states controlled by Republicans, and 2 purple states with divided government. And I was actually kind of pleased that in the lowest 2 rows, Virginia and Wisconsin, those divided government purple states, they were actually the mirror image of each other, one with a Republican governor and Democratic legislature, one with a Democratic governor and Republican legislature. So let's start going into the findings and the research. I wanted to start with some general patterns, which were that oversight systems in all 6 states were under strain. This is partly because there is we know about the strong partisan divisions in our country, and so there was more emphasis on gaining political advantage and not as much interested in the discipline inquiry of oversight. Traditional media has really declined, and that means less attention and information about the nuts and bolts of governance and less discussion of the mechanics of state government. At the same time, there's been a rise of social media with its very fractured ecosystems and its emphasis on instant response. Overall, state legislative oversight was spotty, but there were pockets of strength. And those pockets of strength were often the nonpartisan audit, fiscal, and research offices, which the Levin Center calls analytic bureaucracies, which were created largely in the reform movement of the 1960s and 1970s. These offices remain assets, but they also are under pressure because there's less value attached to independent, nonpartisan analysis. Legislative oversight is rather siloed, and the connections among the different arms of the legislature are often frayed or intermittent. So one thing I had set out to do was talk about the distinctive roles of the different parts of the legislature, what they do as a prelude to also looking at what could we do better. So legislative audit offices, to begin with, really can play a leading role in oversight because that's really their mission. What they are assigned to do is do structured, in-depth examinations, and particularly performance audits are very, very ideal, in effect, for oversight. They're a form of oversight in of themselves. Working by them, the work of audit offices on their own does affect change in executive branch operations. The offices in my study reported executive branch compliance with their recommendations ranging from 51% to almost 90%. But there are also limitations. The long cycle time of the audit process, which can extend for 6 months, a year, or even more, means that audit offices often can't provide legislators with timely information at the moment they need it. And partly due to that fact, audit offices are not well integrated into daily legislative discussions and operations. Furthermore, one reason for that is also that audit offices prize independence and objectivity, which are a core aspect of audit standards. So they often want to keep an arm's length relationship from the politicians they work for. I wanted to spend just a moment also on what I consider a cousin to audit offices, and these I call evaluation offices. They are largely similar in purpose and the nature of their work, but they differ from audit offices by focusing on social science research methods, from survey data to statistical analysis, rather than auditing standards. They generally focus a little more intensively on policy analysis and program effectiveness and pay less attention to internal controls. In my study, the two examples of evaluation offices were the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission and the Virginia Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. Both these bodies benefited from structural factors that made them more consequential. And that emphasis on structural features and embedding oversight is something that was really a core aspect of my paper. This is just one good example. So Texas Sunset plays an important role in recommending whether an agency be continued, modified, or abolished. And unless there is legislation to extend an agency, it has a sunset date and would otherwise expire. So sunset work is consequential, and a sunset bill must move forward. Although I'll put a pin in it, there have been some evasions of that rule, but I don't want to derail us from continuing on the main points. In Virginia, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee, by law, must have 7 of its 14 members as appropriators. So it contains some of the legislature's power players who can make things happen and have a lot of influence. So legislative audit and evaluation offices often have a parent body, an audit or evaluation committee. So these are joint standing committees that assign audit topics, hold hearings on audit reports, and help audit offices with recommendation follow-up. And so these are found in California, Montana, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And they play an important role in connecting audit offices, which often like to stay a little bit on the sidelines. They provide the entry point to circulate and publicize and socialize audit office findings and recommendations. The typical format of these committees is important because it does involve legislative and executive branch senior officials in discussion and problem solving in a public forum. So the typical format is that the audit manager presents the findings and recommendations. There's question and answer from committee members. The executive branch officials of the agencies that was audited then give their response, more question and answer. So you do have an important forum for bringing audit and evaluation findings and recommendations to greater attention within the legislature. One limitation is that an audit committee assignment is one of middling desirability. An audit committee has modest influence. It does not pass legislation normally. Sometimes it does handle a small amount of legislation, but you're not allocating funds. So sometimes there's high turnover that affects the committees. I wanted to share one little anecdote, which I thought was illuminating, which is in California, one of my interviewees said that the Joint Legislative Audit Committee is not a juice committee. And I thought, well, that means it's not super powerful. But he explained that what this means is that it doesn't have fundraising potential. There are no companies and big interest groups who have business before the committee that can contribute to your campaign fundraising. Another really important form of analytic bureaucracy is the Legislative Fiscal Office. Their staff are very knowledgeable about program operations. Unlike audit staff, they're much more closely involved in legislative discussions due to the demands of reviewing and approving the budget, and they essentially serve as budget committee staff. They play a role in monitoring budget execution after the budget is approved and sometimes performance measures. But their big limitation is that the demands of analyzing the budget and advising appropriators leave little time for the deep dives that are important in oversight. So one thing that was noticeable in terms of the connections among legislative units and the working of oversight as a system is that the audit and fiscal offices largely inhabit separate spheres, largely due to differences in the nature of their work. Often they're working in the same legislative buildings, but the audit shop has a much longer term steady process. The fiscal offices have much more intense periods of work, and they're looking at through policy through different lenses. Audit offices are largely looking backward at what happened, and fiscal offices are often doing scenarios of what will happen if we appropriate X amount to program Y. One thing that was noticeable in my case studies was that fiscal offices rarely brought audit results to the attention of appropriators. Budget committees can play a very important role, and these are the parent organizations to the fiscal offices. They play an interesting role because they are sort of secondary actors, but their role can sometimes be very critical. As for fiscal offices, reviewing and approving the budget are all-encompassing and all-absorbing. On top of that, in many states, including California, Texas, Virginia, and Connecticut, budgets have become really big policy vehicles, similar to what we see at the federal level. For example, in California, accompanying the budget in 2023 were 34 budget trailer bills, which are theoretically to implement the budget, but contain a lot of extraneous matter and a lot of policy decisions. So budget committees are doing a ton of budget and policy work. They have the capability and analytic chops to drill down, but only to the level needed for budget decisions. They do have sort of their own superpower, which is the power of the purse, which gives them leverage as well as the opportunity to insert riders and reporting requirements into budget bills. So they're kind of a key player in spots. And I tried to think of good metaphors for the budget committees. And I should mention I'm using budget and appropriations committees synonymously. So the metaphors that I could come up with two from the world of baseball. In some respects, they can be the cleanup hitter that moves the runners across the plate. They can also be seen sometimes as a pinch hitter that comes in to deliver that critical hit that moves everybody forward. So they're important in spots, have power, but also a lot of other duties. I have a few more units to go over, and then I'll proceed to findings and conclusions. But policy committees, standing committees that cover fields such as education, health, and transportation, were consistently a weak link in oversight. One California interviewee gave me an apt term, which was they function as bill mills, particularly during short sessions that many legislatures have. So in California, last session, more than 3,700 bills in the Assembly, almost 1,900 in the Senate. I looked at education, health, and transportation committees in my case study states, and found almost no oversight hearings. Rather, there were sometimes informational hearings, which were about getting up to speed, getting current, but I would not call them oversight. Two more actors to review, but this one is important. Interim committees can play an important role, particularly in legislatures with shorter or biennial sessions. So they were prominent in Texas, Wisconsin, and Montana. And there's a lot of potential here because the interim committees can be a forum for policy and analysis and oversight outside the hectic pace of the session, and therefore provide an opportunity to build consensus and think through issues. Nevertheless, in practice, many legislators don't have the time for interim work. For example, in Texas, legislators are paid $7,200 per year, so they might need to focus on their other jobs during the interim. Unfortunately, the work that I looked at tended to be superficial and emphasize bill drafting. So in effect, preparing the bill mill for the next session. There was one promising example, though, that I wanted to mention: interim budget committees in Montana, which were created in 2021 and meet quarterly to focus on budget execution and program review, with the same exact membership as appropriations subcommittees, meaning that the same people who grappled with the budget during the session are also grappling together on program issues outside of the session. So this seemed like a really important structural feature to mention. I'm going to skip over study committees so that we can get to recommendations that emerge from this work. Audit offices can help audit committees and legislators develop and refine their audit plans. And California's State Auditor's Office is a good example of this. Audit committees can hold hearings on audit reports and secure executive branch commitments to implement recommendations. They can follow up on those commitments when requested by the audit office and sponsor joint hearings with policy committees. One thing that was notable in looking at audit committee meetings is that by their very nature, they tend to spur executive action because the agency officials came ready with examples of what they were already doing to implement audit recommendations. So you could see just the incentive to be responsive was really important. Moreover, when an audit committee is asking for follow-up, you're more likely to be responsive than when it's just the audit office. Fiscal offices and budget committees. Fiscal offices can focus and report on budget execution during the interim period. And the Texas Legislative Budget Board is a very good example of intensive work on execution. And they can serve as a conduit for audit and evaluation offices to the budget committees. Budget committees can convene joint House-Senate subcommittees to examine program operations in more depth and enhance coordination between the chambers. And this was very notable in Montana and Connecticut. Policy committees can participate in joint oversight hearings with audit committees and budget committees and select one or two pressing issues as oversight priorities during each session to carve out some time amidst the flow of legislation that they have to consider. And in doing so, they could use the Levin Center's training on how to develop an oversight plan. Similar for interim and study committees, carving out something in their work plan to do oversight work that is really focused. Finally, the legislative leaders who have the ability to change operations and procedures can ensure that audit committees include a mix of senior and junior legislators so that they're not just kind of the leftover nerds of the legislature. They can coordinate audit and fiscal office assignments on major issues when feasible and establish a formal, structured system of legislative oversight during the interim. In conclusion, as the Levin Center has emphasized, legislative oversight is not only an outcome, but it's an input that improves budgeting, legislation, and the further oversight that you want to do. Legislatures are really complex organizations with many silos that can stop the flow of oversight information. So you need strong vertical and horizontal links by law, policy, and practice that bring them together to follow up on each other's work. We need rules, procedures, and norms to embed oversight into state legislative operations. Thank you very much. I will turn this over to Jesse, and I feel like I've talked for a long time.
All right, thank you so much, Jason. I am going to now share my screen. Back to the beginning of my slides, though. There we go. I want to say thank you very much to the Levin Center for the opportunity to comment on this paper. I want to second what Chuck said in thanking them for the amazing work they do and encouraging both research and practice on oversight. I can only imagine how proud Senator Levin would be of this work. And I also just want to say what a nice gesture it is to name the fellowship after Elise Bean. I only had the pleasure of meeting her a couple of times, but she was just such a lovely person and so knowledgeable. And it's really, really cool to do that. So I had the pleasure of reading Jason's report on embedding oversight in state legislative operations. So I'm going to share a few comments before turning it over to Q&A. I'm going to try to go through these relatively quickly to leave time for Q&A. Jason, I will give you these slides as well as an annotated version of your paper with comments and so on, so that we don't have to go through every single thing. Very quickly, there's lots to like about this paper. I think first and foremost, it is comprehensive, detailed, and thorough. Jason left very few, if any, stones unturned within these 6 states. It really was very interesting just to observe the differences across the states as he so vividly captured them. One thing I like about the analysis of the of oversight in these states is that he is attuned to both institutional design and political realities. So there's some institutions as they're designed that seem like maybe they're good ideas in theory, but then when confronted with the politics, particularly the partisan politics of the day, don't work as well. And I enjoyed and appreciated the fact that he was attuned to both sort of facets of why oversight happens and when it does in these states. And it also, not to steal too much from Chuck, but this was also a very well written and very professional report. It was clearly Jason put a lot of work into this, into the report and into the manuscript, and I want to commend him on that. The remainder of my comments are basically groupings of questions that I had as I went through the manuscript. Almost none of them, or maybe none of them, are I would even characterize as criticisms, but more either suggestions on sort of highlighting the contributions better or more vividly, but also like curiosities that came up for me in reading the manuscript and ways that I think that the findings here could connect to existing literature. So the first set of comments that I want to share just have to do with organization and framing. This is a long manuscript. And so I think it would benefit from a little bit stronger key takeaways on the front end and really driving home what those things are you want us to take away from it on the front end so we know where to look for it throughout the manuscript. By the end of it, I knew where they were, but and the conclusion is really, really strong on this. I would just move some of that up to the front end. Much of it's already there. Particularly for something that is as thorough as this, my own personal preference, like a short list, like a summary of findings and recommendations, maybe even almost like an executive summary would have been super useful for me. More substantively, embedding is obviously a really important term. It's in the title. It does appear in the intro, and we learn what you mean by embedding by reading what you mean by embedding throughout the manuscript. But I would offer a definition of that right at the outset. What do you mean by embedding, and why is it important? Why is why shouldn't we just study audit committees or just study budget committees or whatever? You mentioned in the presentation that you're interested in these things as systems. So just make very clear that that's going to be the thing. That's going to be your contribution as you go through each of these institutions, each of these states. You may also consider highlighting some of the unique and interesting institutions that you run up against. As you say, throughout here, I'll make this point, and this point. I also uncover some really interesting institutions that other states might be interested in either copying or considering. For my money, the Sunset Commission in Texas was the most interesting out of all of these, in part because that idea goes back to Jefferson. He thought that we should sunset everything, including our Constitution. And so that idea has a long and varied history. And so, particularly with this deep dive you've done, show us some of the gems that you've sort of uncovered in the deep dive that you've done. And then the other thing is you actually uncover a couple of really interesting design tensions that as patterns throughout that I think you could play up a little bit more at the beginning of the manuscript. So like one tension is the tension between independence and objectivity, but also having actual political bite and intention. Like those two things are in direct tension. You need both of them for good oversight, but so often it's hard to have one without the other. And so seeing how states mitigate or don't mitigate this tension is really interesting. So anyway, that was something that sort of came out for me in reading. In addition to the organizational things, one thing that was surprisingly absent for me, and Chuck doesn't have his camera on. If he did, I'm sure he's smirking. That, of course, Jesse would ask a question about interest groups. But one thing that really did stand out to me, this is an insanely detailed dive, but stakeholders, interest groups were mentioned really only once or twice throughout the manuscript. And if it is the case that that outside interests don't play a huge part in shaping the way these agencies, audit committees, and so on operate, how are overseers actually learning about problems that they need to oversee? Is it that they're mostly doing, I should say police patrol? Are they mostly doing police patrol style oversight like Connor talked about instead of fire alarms? Is that a major difference between the states and Congress, that there's just, Congress is responding to a lot of these, inputs, but the states aren't? And that also made me wonder if there are APA-like arrangements in the states. Like, is there public comment on regulations in these states? Because a lot of times that is like a conduit for fire alarms to get raised about, hey, this agency really went off, the deep end. You need to look into them. So that did raise a question about a related institution. If it is the case, though, that interest groups are not as prevalent in the sort of oversight process in the states as what they are at the federal level, it's certainly related to this perceived undesirability of the oversight positions. Like if there aren't big companies who are being regulated, who you can help out through the oversight process, it's no small wonder that you're not able to fundraise off that kind of thing. You can see the chat. Oh, we have to wrap it up. Okay. So I'm going to skip over the rest of this. So few questions about some scope conditions and generalizability, because I don't want to get cut off if I can avoid it. Do you see any limitations to the cases that you have in terms of what can generalize to other states, and what could we extend to Congress? There's a number of things that I think are absolutely generalizable, other ones that aren't. Obviously, term limits are a big thing that differentiates the state. Upward mobility was a really interesting one. You don't become upwardly mobile to Congress by engaging in oversight, and that seems like a challenge that is specific to the states. And then, of course, the availability of staff is a huge theme that runs throughout the entire paper. I would have liked to hear a little bit more about what your respondents thought was or wasn't generalizable from the issue areas. You reference other issues several times, and so I'd be curious what they had to say about that. A couple of questions about, again, where these oversight issues are coming from, like how much of the success rates are driven just by being really good at selecting issues effectively versus actual enforcement prowess. And then two bigger comments. What is going on with policymaking and budgets? We see the federal government doing the same thing, which makes sense under divided or, under insecure majorities, but why are unified governments doing it? Ostensibly, they could just pass policy. Why do they have to policy make in budgets? That seems stupid to me, but so that was puzzling to me. And then finally, just an overarching comment. A lot of this manuscript seems to be focused on the sort of quality of governance, avoiding waste, fraud, and abuse side of oversight. There was a little bit less about bureaucratic drift, oh, that crazy EPA is doing stuff that is too liberal than what the original legislation said it should be, just as an example. So I'm curious how much of that, like if there's anything that's specific about what you found here that's specific to that kind of oversight versus the legislative intent kind of oversight. So I'm going to leave it at that and stop sharing so that I don't get further cut off. Okay.
Thank you. A lot for me to look at, which I will look at, and I definitely agree with you about the organization and other issues as well. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid our time has expired. Let me just thank once again, well, first congratulate Jason on his paper and thank Jesse for his really thoughtful comments and for his putting it in a PowerPoint presentation. That's terrific. I think everybody has benefited from this conversation, both the authors and certainly the audience and those of us at the Levin Center who are watching. So we just so want to thank you for joining us today. Again, I want to remind everybody who's interested, scholars who might be in the audience or might be watching the recording later. The Levin Center does plan to once again offer this fellowship beginning and opening applications on December 1st of this year, 2025, and closing that application window on January 31st of 2026. And in the chat in the chat, you can see some details about that. And really, just listening to this conversation and reading these papers, I learned a tremendous amount, both about Congress and oversight conducted there and across these 6 states. It's what we are really attempting to do to bring scholarship and practice closer together so that they can learn from each other and hopefully advance and solve some of these issues that are holding up and preventing the kind of oversight that can really serve our democracy. So without any further ado, once again, thanks to the audience and thanks to all of you. And be sure to tell everyone who might be interested in this that the recording of this conversation will be posted in the next couple days, and we'll be in touch in the near future. Thanks again.
Thank you.